Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for making me part of your day. My name is Dr. Richard Allinger of the Newburgh Theological Seminary, Department of Theology, Division of Church History and Religious Education. In the last session, I was reading to you some of the different events that happened in the life of a young man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was an underground Bible college teacher, seminary teacher, and theologian in Nazi Germany. And the book that I wanted just to share some of the excerpts from with you to give you an idea about the life and time of this man. The book was called Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Prophet, Martyr, and Spy. And in the book you begin to read how has this, in his late 20s and early 30s became involved with a network of people, not just in Nazi Germany, but there was people in America and in France and other European nations that he was working with in a network to actually eliminate Adolf Hitler because he was a threat to peace in that region, and he had the capacity to actually start a world war. And so what I wanted to share with you before I get back into sharing some excerpts from the book in his life, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I wanted to tell you, if you can remember back in September 11th, 2001, the 9/11 terrorist attack on New York City and D.C., it resulted in the loss of over 3,000 lives and the insurance payoffs of over $65 billion for the damages that were done. They really put a dent in America, the terrorist attack. And so the first thing the American government did in the president of George Bush Jr. was to bring together a 9/11 investigating committee to come to a consensus as to what should the American government's response be to this incident happening. And the first person that was summoned to chair the committee, the 9/11 Investigating Committee on the terrorist attack in New York and D.C., was the former Secretary of State in the 37th President of the United States administration, Henry Kissinger, sat in President Nixon's cabinet as Secretary of State. But when summoned to chair this 9/11 committee after the incident, Henry Kissinger had to decline the president's request because he said because of his international clientele and interest that he would not be probably the appropriate person to chair the committee upon the attack of Washington D.C. and the towers in New York City. So another man was chosen to chair the committee, and after some long, hard investigating the incident, they recommended that the government's response should be immediately three things that must actually be accomplished in response to this incident. And the first was that they advised the president to declare war on terror, and that's still ongoing as we speak. The second point was that they should eliminate Saddam Hussein and bin Laden, who probably masterminded the attack, the terrorist attack on America, and that's been accomplished. And the third point is on its way to being accomplished, and that is they have found out that uh, there's a network, like there was a network in Germany during Dietrich Bonhoeffer's day in Nazi Germany, even which included some of Hitler's own generals working with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and other people that networked together secretly to eliminate Hitler. And by the same token, there was found in this investigating committee a network of people, and a third of them probably were in the United Nations in New York City and other places all over the world. They say the network right now that seemingly hates the United States and wants to, they know they can't put United States out of existence, but they can cripple the United States and what they would want to do to change the present geopolitical balance of power and nations in this world, and would like to see an Islamic state imposed. And involved in that, according to the NATO memos in intelligence, they say that this network of 10 million people, which a third of the people are involved in the United Nations, and even probably there's some in this network that are in the American government, just like there were some generals in the network of Dietrich Bonhoeffer to eliminate Hitler in Nazi Germany. And so this 10 million people that are in this network, and a third of that probably is some of the people in the United Nations and government positions in the United States government, would probably want to use nuclear means to hit the United States with using nuclear means to cripple them, so they can turn at the same time. They know that if they were going to try to change, and make what's in place right now is the state of Israel. And if they were going to do something to turn that all around and make all of that region in the Middle East an Islamic state, they would probably have to hit the United States using nuclear means to cripple them, at the same time wage a takeover or an attempt to take over in the Middle East to arrange it to their advantage and what they would like to do. And I guess when that terrorist attack happened, the older people, it reminded them of Pearl Harbor when Japan attacked the United States back in December of 1941. And then all the young people in America realized, after seeing all of this on the internet and television and radio outlets, that apparently somebody hates us. And the investigating committee found out that it's a network of people operating. And so the committee advised, knowing all of this, that the United Nations building in New York City needs to be relocated in Toronto, Canada. And the Prime Minister, Trudeau, has already worked out over a $6 billion construction project. And the new building of the United Nations will be kind of low to the ground, like a bunker type looking building, instead of a high rise like what's in New York City. There is an elevation of a little bit of the building with the United Nations emblem on it. And this all can be found by a Google search and using the words to search relocation of the United Nations site. And you can actually see the pictures of the new building and the money it costs to be doing this. And then once it is accomplished, then the three things the three most important things of the 9/11 investigating committee on the terrorist attack will have been accomplished. So the first two have already been accomplished. The war, President George Bush Jr. declared a war on terror, and Saddam Hussein and Bin Laden were eliminated. Now, the relocation of the United Nations building in Toronto, Canada, is underway. And today is November 4th when the program is recording right now, and we don't really know yet who is the president, but we're hoping that sit on the Juneteenth committee here in Flint, Michigan, that the new president, the president-elect, whoever that will be, because we don't know yet who's going to be the president. All the votes haven't been counted. Whoever the new president-elect is, we hope that we look for them on the Juneteenth committee to actually look for the president to sign, the new president-elect to sign the Juneteenth national observance. And it was a historic and monumental event that happened in U.S. history at a time in the Abraham Lincoln administration where the North and South were killing each other at the rate of more people were killed, the fatality rate in the Civil War than both the World War I and World War II Americans were killed. But Abraham Lincoln remained a stable and honorable president, and he was able to bring keep the Union together, and he also, before he was assassinated, abolished slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, and that's what Juneteenth is all about. And we hope that the Congress has already passed it in the 90s, over 20 years ago, to be a national observance like Columbus Day, to memorialize this event forever in the minds of Americans, and pay tribute to all the people that died in the awful Civil War, and then pay tribute to the abolishment of the ugly institution of slavery, and pay tribute to the 4 million Americans that were in slavery for over 250 years here in the United States. Abraham Lincoln brought that all to an end, and it being passed a national observance signed by the president. We're hoping the president-elect will sign the bill that Congress already approved to make Juneteenth a national holiday. That this will bring tribute to Abraham Lincoln too, for the great president that he was. Now, getting back to the excerpts from the Bonhoeffer book, Pastor, Prophet, Martyr, and Spy, we go back to the first part of the book talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer as a student in Berlin. It was hard for any group of people to live up to the standards expected of and maintained in the Wargenheimstrasse. Bonhoeffer himself admitted that newcomers to his home were put under the microscope. With that background, it was easy for him to create the impression of being superior and standoffish. While traveling in Italy, young Bonhoeffer wrote in his diary that he was suddenly beginning to understand the concept of, quote, church, having seen for the first time a vivid illustration of the church's transcendence of race and national identity. He began to view the church as something universal, leading him into ecumenical movement in Europe. After visiting a church in Paris where Bonhoeffer witnessed both prostitutes and their customers attending Mass, he wrote, "It's much easier for me to imagine a praying murderer a praying prostitute than a vain person praying. Nothing is so at odds with prayer, his vanity. With regard to Christ's words found in Matthew chapter 22, verse 16 through 22, reads, "And they sent out unto him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Master, we know that you are true, and teach the way of God in truth. Neither carest thou for any man, for you regard not the person of men. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar, or not? But Jesus perceived their wickedness, and said, Why tempt ye me, you hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny. And he said unto them, Whose is this image and superscription? They say unto him, Caesar's. Then said he unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. When they had heard these words, they marveled, and left him, and went their way." In these short statements of Christ, found in Matthew chapter 22, verse 22, Bonhoeffer saw a new sphere of government was introduced, the two spheres of church and state, to be distinct and not joined. Bonhoeffer wrote, "The church must completely separate herself from the state." In one essay, Bonhoeffer expressed the Barthian idea that in order to know anything at all about one had to rely on revelation from God. In other words, God could speak into this world. There are many today who believe that God no longer reveals himself in any way except through the Bible, which is his written word. He also speaks in other ways. See, and when you study the Bible, you begin to find out that there were writing prophets who wrote, like the whole book of Jeremiah and the whole book of Isaiah and Daniel, so on. And then there was prophets that weren't writing prophets like Elijah and Elisha, but they did many miracles. And they brought they heard the voice of God, and they brought what thus saith the Lord was to, for instance, the people that were in the government of Israel after Solomon's death and the split the north from the south. I don't believe that the Father who spoke to Noah and told him to build the ark and spoke at the Jordan River when John baptized Jesus, I don't think he went blind, deaf, and dumb, and that he could speak. And this is what today, to anyone he wanted to in their own language, so they could hear him speak if he wanted to. So Bonhoeffer was violently opposed to the notion of religion, stating that the real message of Christ is basically immoral and irreligious. Let me repeat that. Stating that the real message of Christ is basically immoral and irreligious. Paradoxical as that may sound. In Bonhoeffer's Thursday Circle, he often asked his young attendees difficult questions. One such question was, is there such a thing as a necessary lie? Bonhoeffer was taken back by the languorous climate of Barcelona and was amazed at how people of all ages seemed to while away he saw in Barcelona people of all ages sitting for hours in cafes in the middle of the day, be chattering about little of any real substance, still rather than speak out against what he considered an indolent lifestyle. He had adapted to it, entering the lives and to some extent the lifestyles of the people he was charged with serving as a pastor. In 1929, for a time, Bonhoeffer was in a position that was well beneath his qualifications, yet he performed his duties with enthusiasm and purpose. Bonhoeffer returned from Rome in mid-June, enrolling in the summer semester at Berlin University. Switching colleges after a year or two was common in Germany. He had never planned to stay in Tübingen more than a year. He would study in Berlin 7 semesters, earning his doctorate in 1927 at the age of 21. Dietrich's decision to study at Berlin University was not difficult. For one thing, it was in Berlin, which for someone addicted to cultural stimulation made it ideal. Hardly a week passed that he didn't go to a museum, opera, or concert, and Berlin was home with all that it entailed. A more stimulating environment cannot be imagined. Bonhoeffer's principal reason for choosing Berlin University was its theological faculty, which was world-renowned and had included the famous Friedrich Schleiermacher, whose presence still hovered palpably. In 1924, the theological faculty was headed by Adolf von Harnack, then 73, and Adolf von Harnack was on the faculty there at the University of Berlin, and he was 73 and a living legend in his own time. He was a disciple of Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher in theological circles was known as the father of liberal theology, liberalism. Part of the movement of that time in the 1800s, German rationalism began to rise, and biblical criticism by different theologians at that time, and Charles Darwin calling into question the creation of man, which might be not biblical. And so I believe, along with at this time in the 1800s up to the time of Bonhoeffer and Hitler in Germany, probably the biblical criticism and Charles Darwin's thinking and liberal theology moved the Lutherans, Martin Luther's German church, into actually caving into the Third Reich and allowing Hitler to actually supplant Christ and become the Messiah himself there, which is part of that kind of thinking, biblical criticism and Darwin's evolution and the German rationalism and such as this would begin to make a people unlike the Christians should be, and it would be easier to apostatize a church if their pulpits, their pastors, and their seminaries begin to teach on biblical theology, of which this movement began to espouse, and actually probably had a part in actually Adolf Hitler coming to power and creating all the atrocities that he did with regard to not just eliminating 6 million Jewish people, but 14 other million Gentile people in Germany and Europe for being not of the Aryan race, or might have been handicapped in some way. He would eliminate a lot of people before he was stopped by the Allied effort that ended the war. And the staunchly theologically liberal and one of the leaders of the historical critical method of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the reason Germinal rationalism and some of the theological thought of that day, it was actually calling into question the inerrancy of the scriptures and the sufficiency of the scriptures and so on. And it probably had a great factor in bringing to power this Adolf Hitler and his capacity to do great atrocities to not just Germany but all of Europe, the world, if he wasn't stopped. His approach to the Bible was limited to textual and historical critical. In other words, what I'm trying to say is the spiritual condition of any nation lies not in its government, but right at the doorsteps of its church. And God help any nation that are atheistic and don't even have a belief in God. His approach to the Bible was limited to textual and historical critical analysis, and had led him to conclude that the miracles it described never happened, and that the Gospel of John, they even wanted to make a Bible without the supernatural miracles. Yeah, okay. In the last minute, I wanted to finish up this why, with regard to the twisting of the scriptures into a Nazi theologic paradigm, led him to conclude that the miracles it described never happened, and that the Gospel of John was not canonical. And I want you to come back, if you can join me in the next session where I can pick up on this, what made Nazi Germany and its leader, Adolf Hitler, the man he was and the country it was and what it did. I hope you can get right back with me. Thank you for getting back with me and making me part of your day in my programs of church history. Before I get back into studying some excerpts out of a book by Eric Metaxas of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Nazi Germany, I wanted to go back to the New Testament Bible verses. And in Acts chapter 2, now, in the Bible, there was a known as a former rain and a latter rain. Now, the former rain was at the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem when Peter delivered his sermon and that's called the former rain. And it didn't really happen until Pentecost in the former rain was fully come. And since that time, there is a latter rain Pentecost, and that is happening right now, and it hasn't fully come yet. And so I'm going to read to you what will happen as the full Pentecost of the latter rain movement is actually fully come, like it fully came in the former rain in Jerusalem at Pentecost. In Acts chapter 2, verse 14, it says, For Peter, standing up with the 11, lifted up his voice and said unto them, Ye men of Judea, and all ye that dwell at Jerusalem, be this known unto you, and hearken to my words, for these are not drunken, as ye suppose, seeing it is but the third hour of the day. But this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel, and it shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out of my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And on my servants and on my handmaidens I will pour out in those days of my spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will shew wonders in the heavens above, and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and notable day of the Lord come. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And then in Acts chapter 2, verse 17, it says, Therefore let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God hath made that same Jesus, whom ye have crucified, both Lord and Christ. Now when they had heard this, they were pricked in their hearts, and said unto Peter and to the rest of the apostles, Men and brethren, what shall we do? Then Peter said unto them, Repent, and be baptized every one of you in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and ye shall receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. For the promise is unto you and to your children, and to all that are far off, even as many as the Lord our God shall call. And with many other words did he testify and exhort, saying, Save yourselves from this untoward generation. So and that's what's happening right now since Pentecost. Now that was the former rain in the Bible, and then in the Bible it says about the latter rain, and its Pentecost hasn't fully come yet, like it did on the day of Pentecost in the former rain. So it's still going on, where your young men are seeing visions and your old men are dreaming dreams, and God is showing wonders in the heaven above, signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. When that is all fully come, then it will have fully come. But it's moving now, the latter rain, with the momentum of being accelerated by the Spirit of God, and is moving to its fully coming into fruition in what it is. A mighty movement of the Spirit of God, and we Christians know it as a great awakening and revival and so on. Now, getting back to the excerpts from the Bonhoeffer book, led him to conclude that miracles it described never happened. In other words, I was talking to you about how some biblical critics of the 1800s and early 1900s might have been liberal theologians who wanted to delete the miracles from the Bible and call the inerrancy of the Scriptures into question and the sufficiency of the Scriptures into question. And that was partly of what was called German rationalism that led to actually Germany falling Dr. Martin Luther's Lutheran German Church apostatizing and caving into the twisted Nazi theology, making Adolf Hitler the Messiah instead of Jesus Christ. And the German rationalism and all of that took place in the late 1800s up to the time of the Third Reich in the 1930s of the 20th century led to all of this awful things happening with regard to the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust, and the other 14 million people that were killed as a result of the Third Reich being in power at that time. And the Gospel of John, some said were not. Some of these theologians of a liberal stripe was saying that the Gospel of John was not canonical. Harnack one of these theologians, Harnack lived in Grunwald neighborhood, as did most distinguished academics then, close to the University of Berlin, and the young Bonhoeffer would often walk with him the Halensee train station and ride with him into Berlin. He attended Harnack's prestigious seminar for 3 semesters and esteemed the venerable scholar greatly, though he rarely agreed with his theological conclusions. A fellow student in Harnack's seminar, Helmuth Goals recalled feeling a secret enthusiasm for Bonhoeffer's free, critical, and independent theological thinking. What really impressed me was not just the fact that he surpassed almost all of us in theological knowledge and capacity, but what passionately attracted me to Bonhoeffer was the perception that here was a man who did not only learn and gather in the verba and scripta of some master, but one who thought independently and already knew what he wanted and wanted what he knew. I had the experience. For me, it was something alarming and magnificently new. Bonhoeffer wrote in his journals, hearing a young fair-haired student contradict the reverend historian, His Excellency von Harnack, contradict him politely but clearly on positive theological grounds. Harnack answered, but the student contradicted again and again. Bonhoeffer was a remarkable independent thinker, especially for one so young. Some professors regarded him as arrogant, especially because he refused to come to directly under the influence of any one of them, always preferring to maintain some distance. But someone who grew up dining with Karl Bonhoeffer, Dietrich's brother, and who was allowed to speak only when he could justify every syllable, had probably developed a certain intellectual confidence and may be somewhat excused if he was not intimidated by other great minds. Besides Harnack, 3 other Berlin professors had a decided influence on Bonhoeffer. They were Karl and was perhaps the greatest Luther scholar of that generation, Reinhold Seeberg, who specialized in systematic theology, and under whom Bonhoeffer wrote his doctoral thesis, and Adolf Diesmann, who was Bonhoeffer's introduction to the ecumenical movement, which would play such an important role in his life and provide the means by which he became involved in the conspiracy against Hitler. But there was also theologian in Germany who had a greater influence on Bonhoeffer than any of these. And when he would revere and respect as much as anyone in his lifetime, who would even become a mentor and a friend. This was Karl Barth of Göttingen. Barth was Swiss by birth and was almost certainly the most important theologian of the century, the 20th century. Many would say of the last 5 centuries. Bonhoeffer's cousin Hans Christoph was studying physics at Göttingen in 1924, but after hearing Barth, he promptly switched to theology and stayed there. Like most theological students in the late 19th century, Barth absorbed the regent liberal theology of his time that he grew to reject it, quickly becoming its most formidable opponent. His groundbreaking 1922 commentary, The Epistle to the Romans, fell like a smart bomb into the ivory tower of scholars like Adolf von Harnack, who could hardly believe their historical fortress pregnable, and who were scandalized by Barth's approach to the Bible, which came to be called neo-orthodoxy. See, there's like between belief and unbelief, paradigms or genres. You start out with atheism on one end, and then go into liberal and conservative interpretations of the scriptures by theologians, and this is where neo-orthodoxy comes in with Barth in the 20th century, they were scandalized by Barth's approach to the Bible, which came to be called neo-orthodoxy instead of orthodoxy, and asserted the idea, particularly controversial in German theological circles, that God actually exists and that all theology and biblical scholarship must be undergirded by this basic assumption, and that's that. Barth was the principal figure in challenging and overturning the influence of the German historical critical approach pioneered at Berlin University by the father of liberal theology, Friedrich Schleiermacher, and furthered there by the current eminence Greece, von Harnack. Barth stressed the transcendence of God, describing him as wholly other and therefore completely unknowable by man except via revelation. Fortunately, he believed in revelation, which was further scandalous to theological liberals who would like to forget all the supernatural elements of the Holy Scriptures, like Harnack. For refusing to swear his allegiance to Hitler, Barth would be kicked out of Germany in 1934, and he would become the principal author of the Barmen Declaration, in which the confessing church triumphed its rejection of the Nazis' attempt to bring their philosophy into the German church. Harnack's theology was something like Archilochus's proverbial fox knowing many little things, while Barth's theology was like a hedgehog knowing one big thing. Bonhoeffer would side with the hedgehog, but he was in the fox's seminar, and through his family and the Grunewald community, he had many ties with the fox. As a result of his intellectual openness, Bonhoeffer learned how to think like a fox and respect the way a fox's thought. Even though he was in the camp of the hedgehog, he could appreciate the value in something, even if he ultimately rejected this something, and could see the errors and flaws in something, even if he ultimately accepted that something. This attitude figured into his creation of the illegal seminaries of Zingst and Finkenwalde, which incorporated the best of both Protestant and Catholic traditions. Because of this self-critical intellectual integrity, Bonhoeffer sometimes had such confidence in his conclusions that he could seem arrogant. The debate during Bonhoeffer's time between the neo-orthodox Barthians and the historical critical liberals was similar to the contemporary one between strict Darwinian evolutionists and the advocates of the so-called intelligent design. The latter allow the possible involvement of something outside the system, some intelligent creator, whether divine or otherwise, while the former reject this by definition. Theological liberals like Harnack felt it was unscientific to speculate on who God was. The theologian must simply study what is here, which is to say, the text and the history of those texts. But the Barthians say no. The God on the other side of the fence had revealed himself through these texts, and the only reason for these texts was to know him. Bonhoeffer agreed with Barth, seeing the text was not just historical sources, but as agents of revelation, not merely specimens of writing, but sacred canon. Bonhoeffer was not against doing historical and critical work on biblical text. Indeed, he had learned from Harnack how to do it and could do it brilliantly. Harnack powerfully flattered the 8-year-old when, after reading the 57-page essay Bonhoeffer wrote for his seminar, he suggested Bonhoeffer might someday do his dissertation in the field. I meant to say, at the time Bonhoeffer was at Berlin University, 18 years old, and he astounded some of the renowned theologians that were there. I had said that he was 8 years old. I think Jesus was about 12 when he was astounding the elders in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, under Judaism in Jerusalem. But the Bonhoeffer was about 18 when he was in the University of Berlin under the instruction of these theologians that we've been citing. He suggested Bonhoeffer might someday do his dissertation in that field. See, the older theologians in Berlin University looked upon the young 18-year-old like he had a lot of potential. Harnack obviously hoped to convince him to follow in his footsteps by choosing the field of church history. As ever, Bonhoeffer cagily maintained a certain distance. He wished to learn from the old master, but would preserve his intellectual independence. In the end, he would not choose church history. He respected that field, as he demonstrated by mastering it to Harnack's delight. But he disagreed with Harnack that one must stop there. He believed that picking over the text as they did and going no further left behind rubble and fragments. It was that God beyond the text, the God who was their author and who spoke to mankind through them, that fired his interest. For his doctrinal dissertation, Bonhoeffer was drawn to dogmatics with study of the beliefs of the church. Dogmatics was closer to philosophy, and Bonhoeffer was at heart more philosopher than textual critic. He didn't want to disappoint his friendly old neighbor Harnack, who continued to woo him. But now Bonhoeffer had another eminent professor to deal with. Reinhold Seeberg's field was dogmatics. So it seemed Bonhoeffer might write his dissertation under him. This presented not one, but two difficulties. First, well, these excerpts from Eric Metaxas's book on Bonhoeffer. I put on these legal pads, and I have to find the second legal pad to pick up with the excerpts that I wanted to cite for you. Seeberg was a bitter rival of Harnack, and the two of them were competing for the theological affections of the same young theological genius. And second, Seeberg was deeply opposed to Barthenian theology. In his essay for Seeberg's seminar, Bonhoeffer expressed the Barthian idea that in order to know anything at all about God, one had to rely on revelation from God. In other words, God could speak into this world, but man could not reach out of this world to examine God. It was a one-way street, and of course this was directly related to the especially Lutheran doctrine of grace. Man could not earn his way up to heaven, but God could reach down and graciously lift man toward him. In that theology, along with John Calvin and Martin Luther, saw the utter inability of man to, without the working of the Holy Spirit being drawn to him with his everlasting love, even know him, who had created him and then redeemed him through the Lamb of God, and that died for the sin of the world. Seeberg disagreed, and after reading Bonhoeffer's essay, he became agitated. It was as though a cocky Barthian rooster had sneaked into his chicken coop. He thought he might talk sense into the brash young genius's head by appealing to a higher authority, and that summer at a meeting of distinguished Berlin academics, they had conversations with both those that held to Barthian views and Seeberg's views. After spending time with the close family members, hiking along the Baltic coast, sharing his theological thoughts throughout the month of August, by September, he made his decision he would write his doctoral dissertation under Seeberg after all, but it would be on the subject dogmatic and historical. He would write about the subject he had began puzzling over in Rome, namely, what is the church? It was eventually titled Sanctorum Communio, Sanctorum Communio, Latin words, a dogmatic inquiry into sociology of the church. Bonhoeffer would identify the church has neither a historical entity nor an institution, but has Christ existing as church community. It was a stunning debut. During these 3 years in Berlin, Bonhoeffer had a staggering workload, yet he completed his doctoral dissertation in 18 months. But somehow he had a very full life beyond the world of academics, too. He was endlessly attending operas, concerts, art expositions, and plays. He maintained a copious correspondence with friends, colleagues, and family, and perpetually traveling on long and short trips. In one of Barth's seminars, perhaps at the first discussion evening, a student had quoted Luther's famous maxim that sometimes the curses of the godless sound better than the hallelujahs of the pious. Barth, pleased with what he heard, asked who had said it. It was Bonhoeffer. This was likely the first time they met. They soon became friends. On July 23rd, the 45-year-old Barth invited the 25-year-old Bonhoeffer to dinner. Bonhoeffer was alone with Dr. Barth, able to ask questions he had had for years. I have been impressed even more by discussions with him than by his writings and his lectures, Bonhoeffer said, for he is really all there. I have never seen anything like it before, he added. There is with him an openness, a readiness for any objection which should hit the mark, and along with this such concentration and impetus insistence on the point, whether it is made arrogantly or modestly, dogmatically or completely uncertainly, and not only when it serves his own theology. In the next 2 years, Bonhoeffer visited Barth often. In September 1932, just after Barth completed the first volume of his landmark Church Dogmatics, Bonhoeffer visited him on the Bergille in Switzerland. He also saw Suess, who introduced him to the Swiss theologian Emil Brunner. In 1933, when a chair in theology opened at Berlin University, Bonhoeffer tried to leverage his family's connections in the Prussian Ministry of Culture on Barth's behalf. But Hitler had just taken power as the Reichskanzler. Once that happened, everything was politicized, and no one who disdained Hitler's views could get an important position in academia or anywhere else. The chair went to Georg Wolbermin, who was cut of the same brown cloth as the new Reichskanzler of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany and Nazi theology of the apostate church. Barth wrote to Bonhoeffer afterward, in the era of Reichskanzler Hitler, Wolbermin will certainly fill Schleiermacher's chair in a fashion more true to type than I should have done. I hear that you have come out strongly on my behalf. I should undoubtedly have accepted the world is in bad shape, but we don't want to let our pipe go out under any circumstance, do we? All right, in the last minute, I'm going to wind up some of these excerpts of Dietrich Bonhoeffer at a later session, but just say this, but at this point of Hitler's ascent to the chancellorship, as being from Austria, a corporal in a former war from Austria, now in Germany, Hitler rising to power, it was at this point of Hitler's ascent to chancellorship was 2 years in the imaginable future. Bonhoeffer had been in New York a mere 9 months, but in some way it seemed like a lifetime. When he left, the Nazis were a tiny gray cloud on the horizon of an otherwise clear sky. Now, black and crackling with electricity, they loom nearly overhead. And with that, I want to say to you, I hope that you all, viewers and hearers of the programs on the radio and television, would have a happy Thanksgiving. And if you want to go to Facebook, you can find me at Richard Leslie Allinger and like me, or follow me on Twitter or tweet me. All right, we'll see you in the next session in December. Happy Thanksgiving.